Hey everyone, this is Sebastian, your host from Money Teacher. So I need to show you something that happened in the last few hours that's absolutely unprecedented in modern diplomatic history. The President of the United States just publicly uninvited an entire country from what he's calling the most prestigious board of world leaders ever assembled. And I'm not talking about an adversary. I'm talking about Canada, our neighbor, our ally. Let me back up for a second because this gets complicated fast. 3 days ago, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of the world's most powerful people at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and he basically told them that the rules-based international order is dead. He didn't dance around it. He said, quote, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition." Now here's where it gets interesting. Carney didn't mention Trump by name even once during this speech, but everyone in that room knew exactly what he was talking about. He stood there and said that great powers are now using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, and financial infrastructure as coercion. The audience gave him a standing ovation. When was the last time you saw global elites give a standing ovation to someone calling out American hegemony? But here's what nobody saw coming. Just hours after Trump formally launched his so-called Board of Peace in Davos, he took to Truth Social and posted what can only be described as a diplomatic middle finger to Canada. He wrote directly to Carney, "Please let this letter serve to represent that the Board of Peace is withdrawing its invitation to you regarding Canada's joining what will be the most prestigious board of leaders ever assembled at any time." Let that sink in for a moment. The president just kicked out America's closest neighbor, trading partner, and military ally from a peace initiative, and he did it via social media in a public post for the entire world to see. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole picture. This Board of Peace wasn't originally supposed to be some kind of global power play. It started as a mechanism to oversee the ceasefire in Gaza. It had UN Security Council backing. It was meant to manage reconstruction after the war. But somewhere along the way, Trump decided this was going to be his alternative to the United Nations itself. And then this happened. Trump started requiring permanent members to pay $1 billion each for their seat at the table. $1 billion with a B. Countries could join without paying, but they'd only get a 3-year membership. Canada said they'd join in principle, but they made it crystal clear they weren't writing that check. Wait, it gets worse. The Canadian finance minister literally told reporters in Davos, "Canada is not going to pay if we were to join the Board of Peace." That was earlier this week. Before Carr's speech, before Trump's disinvitation, they were already drawing a line in the sand over money. This is the part that kept me up last night. Look at who to join this board. Argentina, Bahrain, Morocco, Pakistan, Turkey. These are countries looking for influence, looking for access to American power. And then look at who didn't join. The UK said no. France said no. Germany's been cautious. Italy hasn't committed. These are America's traditional allies, and they're all taking a step back. Let me take you inside what Carney actually said in Davos, because this wasn't your typical diplomatic speech. This was someone burning bridges in real time, and I don't think he cared who was watching. Carney stood there and told the most powerful people on earth to stop pretending. He said, "Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is, a system of intensifying great power rivalry, where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion." But that's not even the real story. The real story is what he said next. He looked at middle powers like Canada and told them they have a choice. Like, you can compete with each other for favor from the hegemon, or you can combine to create a third path. He was essentially telling countries to band together against American dominance without actually saying America's name. And then he dropped this line, "If you are not at the table, you are on the menu." Think about the timing here. Carney gave this speech while Trump was literally in Davos, preparing to launch his Board of Peace. Trump was trying to assemble his coalition of world leaders, and Canada's Prime Minister was in another room telling everyone that the American order is finished. Here's what nobody's talking about. Just 1 week before this speech, Carney was in Beijing announcing a new strategic partnership with China. With China, Canada just signed major trade deals with China, while Trump is trying to contain Chinese influence globally. And then Carney goes to Davos and gets a standing ovation for basically saying the world needs to resist economic coercion from great powers. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. The day after Carney's speech, Trump responded at his own Davos address. He said, "Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, and that Canada lives because of the United States." He looked directly at the crowd and said, "Remember that, Mark. The next time you make your statements, Canada lives because of the United States." Let me repeat that. The President of the United States told the world that Canada only exists because America allows it to. Carney fired back immediately. He said, "Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." And then he added, "We are masters in our home. This is our own country. It's our future. The choice is up to us." This is where it gets complicated. Trump's Commerce Secretary went on television and said about Carney's speech, "They have the second best deal in the world, and all I got to do is listen to this guy whine and complain." The second best deal in the world. He's talking about USMCA, the trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And here's the thing, that agreement is up for mandatory review this year. So now we've got Canada's Prime Minister publicly calling for middle powers to resist American coercion, Trump uninviting Canada from his peace initiative, and a critical trade agreement coming up for review in the next few months. You starting to see where this is going. But wait, it gets worse. Trump has been floating this idea of a Golden Dome missile defense system that would supposedly protect North America from threats. He's been saying Canada needs this protection, that they should be grateful for it. But what he's really saying is that Canada depends on American military power for survival. Carney's response? He doubled down. In a speech back in Canada, he said the country needs to be a beacon, an example to a world at sea. He said Canada can show that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and that the arc of history doesn't have to bend toward authoritarianism. Let me show you just how isolated this board of peace actually is. Because what Trump is selling and what countries are buying are two completely different things. Trump claims nearly 30 countries have signed on. He says everyone wants to be part of it. But when you actually look at the list, something really interesting emerges. You've got Argentina under President Milei, who's basically Trump's biggest fan in South America. You've got Middle Eastern countries like Bahrain and Morocco who depend on American security guarantees. You've got Pakistan who's always playing both sides. You've got Turkey who's trying to position itself as a bridge between East and West. Notice what's missing. Every major European democracy, every traditional American ally with the capacity to actually contribute to global peace and security. The UK Foreign Secretary literally said they won't be signatories, and she specifically cited concerns about Putin being invited to join. Wait, did I just say Putin? Yes, Trump invited Russia to join this board of peace. He also invited China and Belarus. And here's what makes this absolutely surreal. He invited Ukraine too. So Trump wants Ukraine and Russia, countries actively at war with each other, to sit on the same peace board. How exactly is that supposed to work? But here's where it gets really interesting. Benjamin Netanyahu announced that Israel will join the board. Netanyahu, the guy with an international criminal court arrest warrant hanging over his head for alleged war crimes in Gaza. He's been conducting a military campaign there for over 2 years. And now he's going to sit on a board that's supposedly overseeing peace in the very place he's been bombing. You can't make this stuff up. Now, here's what nobody's talking about. Netanyahu's own office initially criticized the composition of the board's executive committee because it includes Turkey, a regional rival that's been extremely critical of Israel's Gaza operations. But then Netanyahu did a complete 180 and decided to join anyway. What changed? What pressure was applied? What deals were made behind closed doors? This is the part that kept me up last night. The Board of Peace was originally created with a specific UN mandate to manage post-war Gaza. It had international legitimacy. It had a clear purpose. The UN Security Council actually passed a resolution endorsing it as part of Trump's Gaza peace plan. That gave it credibility that made it look like a legitimate international institution. But then Trump decided to turn it into some kind of alternative United Nations, and the whole thing fell apart. The official charter for the Board of Peace. It doesn't even mention Gaza, not once. The thing that was supposed to be its entire reason for existing has been completely erased from its founding document. Instead, Trump is talking about it as a mechanism that can do pretty much whatever we want to do. Those were his actual words in Davos. Once this board is completely formed, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do. That's not how international institutions are supposed to work. That's not how peace processes function. That's how personal thieves operate. European Union President Antonio Costa came out and said the EU has serious doubts about a number of elements in the Charter of the Board of Peace related to its scope, its governance, and its compatibility with the UN Charter. Translation: they think Trump is trying to replace the UN with his own personal coalition, and they want no part of it. But wait, it gets worse. The EU said they're willing to work with the Board of Peace specifically on Gaza, but only on Gaza. They're drawing a very clear line. They're saying we'll help with the humanitarian mission you were originally supposed to do, but we're not endorsing your vision of remaking the global order. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes everything. The $1 billion membership fee isn't just about money. It's about creating a two-tier system where countries that pay get permanent influence, and countries that don't are temporary members with limited say. It's literally pay-to-play international diplomacy. 3-year members versus permanent members, those who buy in versus those who don't. And then this happened. Poland's president said he wants to join but needs parliamentary approval first. Italy's prime minister said the same thing. These are convenient excuses that let them avoid saying no directly, while also not saying yes. It's diplomatic theater. They're kicking the can down the road because they don't want to openly defy Trump. But they also don't want to be associated with this thing. Here's what nobody's talking about. California Governor Gavin Newsom, a potential Democratic presidential candidate, told the Davos Forum that multiple American leaders sent him transcripts of Carney's speech. He said, "I respect what Carney did because he had courage of convictions. We can lose our republic as we know it." Think about that for a second. An American governor from California, the world's 5th largest economy, is praising a foreign leader for standing up to the American president. He's saying that what Carney did took courage. That's how fractured things have become within America itself, let alone internationally. But wait, there's more. The UN spokesperson came out and said that UN engagement with the Board of Peace would only be in the context of Gaza. They're not endorsing Trump's broader vision. They're treating this as a limited, specific mechanism for one conflict. The UN is essentially saying, we gave you authority to help manage Gaza reconstruction, not to rebuild the entire international system. This is where things get really complicated. Trump is trying to build a new world order, but he's doing it with countries that either need American money, need American protection, or are actively opposed to the existing Western alliance system. The countries with actual capacity to maintain global peace and security, the ones with advanced militaries, stable democracies, and functional institutions, they're all sitting this one out. Indonesia joined, Qatar joined, Egypt joined, Saudi Arabia joined. These are important regional players, don't get me wrong, but none of them are democracies with the institutional capacity to actually enforce international peace agreements. None of them have the military capability to deploy peacekeepers globally. None of them have the diplomatic infrastructure to mediate complex international disputes. What Trump has assembled is a coalition of the willing to accept American leadership, not a coalition of the capable to maintain global peace. There's a huge difference. So, let's talk about what's actually happening here because this goes way deeper than just diplomatic drama between Trump and Carney. What we're watching is the real-time collapse of the post-World War II international order, and nobody seems to have a plan for what comes next. Carney was right about one thing in his speech. We're not in a transition, we're in a rupture. The old system is breaking, and the new system is this: a reality TV president creating a pay-to-play peace board, while America's closest ally tells him to get lost. Here's what I'm seeing. Canada just signed 12 trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. 12 deals. In 6 months, they're diversifying away from American dependence at record speed. They're doubling their defense spending. They're building closer ties with the European Union. And most significantly, they just announced a strategic partnership with China. Let me repeat that last part because it's crucial. Canada, America's neighbor, America's closest trading partner, America's NATO ally, just announced a strategic partnership with China. While Trump is trying to contain Chinese influence globally, Carney was literally in Beijing last week shaking hands with Xi Jinping, touting the importance of their relationship in what he called a new world order. This is not normal Canadian behavior. Canada has spent 75 years as America's quiet, dependable partner. They've been the country that always backed us up, always had our back, always worked within the system. They've been so reliable that most Americans don't even think about the relationship. It's just assumed. And now they're publicly calling for middle powers to band together against economic coercion from great powers. That's a fundamental shift in how Canada sees its place in the world. But here's where it gets really interesting. Other countries are watching this very carefully. When Canada stands up to American pressure and doesn't immediately get crushed for it, that sends a signal. When Carney gets a standing ovation in Davos for calling out American hygiene, that tells other middle powers that resistance is possible, that maybe they don't have to just accept whatever terms the United States dictates. Now, what I'm about to tell you is crucial. Trump's response to all of this, kicking Canada out of the Board of Peace, it's not strength, it's weakness disguised as strength. When you have real power, you don't need to publicly humiliate your allies for disagreeing with you. When you have actual influence, you bring people into the tent. You don't kick them out. You find ways to accommodate different perspectives. You build coalitions through persuasion and mutual benefit. But Trump's approach is all punishment and no incentive. You disagree with me, you're out. You won't pay my membership fee. You're uninvited. You give a speech I don't like. You're publicly humiliated on social media. That's not how you maintain an alliance system. That's how you destroy one. And then this happened. The trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, USMCA, comes up for mandatory review this year. It's written into the agreement. Every 6 years, the three countries have to sit down and evaluate whether the deal is working. That review is happening in 2026. Right now, in the middle of this diplomatic crisis, Canada is already preparing for a trade war. They're building alternative supply chains. They're securing critical minerals. They're strengthening their manufacturing base. They're positioning themselves to weather whatever Trump throws at them. And here's the thing, they might actually be able to do it. Think about what that means for American leverage. If Canada survive a trade war with the United States, if they can maintain their economy and their standard of living while resisting American pressure, then every other middle power in the world is going to take notes. They're going to realize that American economic dominance isn't as absolute as it used to be, that there are ways to resist, ways to build alternative relationships, ways to maintain sovereignty in the face of American coercion. Here's what nobody's talking about. Trump keeps saying Canada depends on the United States for security, for prosperity, for everything. He literally said Canada lives because of the United States. But Canada's response is basically, prove it. They're calling his bluff. They're building their own defense capabilities, diversifying their trade relationships, and forming coalitions with other countries who are tired of being pushed around. This is the part that should concern everyone. The international system works when there's a rough consensus about the rules. It doesn't matter if every country loves those rules, but there needs to be some agreement that following the rules is better than not following them. What we're seeing now is the largest American ally in geographic terms, saying the rules don't work anymore, and they're not going to pretend otherwise. Carney literally said in his speech, "You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination." He's calling out the entire premise of the American global order. He's saying that what was sold as mutual prosperity has become a mechanism for American control. And you know what the scariest part is? A lot of countries probably agree with him. They just haven't been willing to say it out loud. But now that Canada has said it, now that Carney has gotten a standing ovation for saying it, other leaders are going to feel emboldened. They're going to start asking harder questions. They're going to start demanding better terms. Where does this go from here? That's the real question. Does Canada's resistance inspire other countries to push back? Do we see the formation of a real coalition of middle powers trying to create an alternative to both American hegemony and Chinese influence? Or does Trump find a way to bring Canada back into the fold? What I'm watching for is whether other countries follow Canada's lead. If the UK starts making similar moves, if France and Germany decide they'd rather work with Canada than with Trump's Board of Peace, then we're looking at a fundamental realignment of the Western alliance. If that happens, American global influence will be weaker in 2026 than it's been at any point since World War II. But there's another possibility that I think is more likely in the short term. Canada and the US eventually find a way to work this out, but the relationship is permanently changed. Canada knows now that they can't rely on American partnership as a given. They've built alternative relationships, alternative trade routes, alternative security arrangements. Even if things calm down, Canada is never going back to being the quiet neighbor. The genie is out of the bottle. And here's the really interesting question that nobody's asking. What happens when other middle powers realize they can do the same thing? What happens when South Korea looks at Canada's example and decides they don't need to just accept American terms on trade and security? What happens when Mexico, sitting right there in USMCA negotiations with both the US and Canada, decides they have more leverage than they thought? Trump's Board of Peace was supposed to demonstrate American leadership. It was supposed to show that the United States can assemble coalitions and solve global problems. Instead, it's become a perfect example of why the American order is failing. The countries with real capacity don't want to join. The countries that do join are either dependent on American aid or actively trying to undermine the existing system. And America's closest ally just publicly said no thanks and got a standing ovation for it. This is what decline looks like. Not sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of influence. A slow realization by other countries that they have options. A growing willingness to say no. A shift from automatic deference to calculated resistance. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Carney's strategy of publicly confronting American power make sense for Canada? Or is he playing with fire in a way that's going to hurt Canadians more than it hurts Trump? Where do you think this relationship goes from